I'm from Houston, Texas. I've been a freelance IT consultant for the last few years. I am the author of Reango. In the next slide, it shows like it started about a year ago, November 2016. I've consulted for one company in Silicon Valley. They reached out to me about it, so it was one of those like write an open source thing and you might get hired. So without further ado, let's get started. This presentation is going to cover what is a single page app, why Django, just a real quick intro. Then we're going to talk about the technologies used, because there's a lot of them: Webpack, React, Relay, like GraphQL. What do they all do, right? And then we'll be looking at some code examples, right? Because the goal of Reango was to like reimagine the Django polls app tutorial. I don't know. Have you guys ever heard of that? Have you guys ever been through the Django polls app? Cool. And then just some other notes. So obviously, why we'd want to use Django, great backend, frustrating to build complex front ends. We want a modern front end that feels like a native application, right? Even if it's on the web. And a sane starting point for other projects. That's sort of like why I created Reango. Yeah, some more, I kind of told you that already. So not just a single page application, but it can also be a progressive web app, which means it should also work offline and on flaky internet connections. Some interesting things I've seen with that, like recently, like even as like if your users are offline, you can keep Google Analytics running and still track them even while they're offline, what they're doing. So that's some cool stuff. Along with like all of your assets are cached offline with a service worker. But we don't go into that. We're not going to go into that too much. Yeah, so why boilerplate? Once again, we're kind of reiterating this. Easy starting point, automated testing and deployment. So we want to have really good examples for how to test the app, also how to deploy it. So it's not just just the app. It's the whole stack, right? Minimal working examples with all the dependencies, right? And so Reango's sort of there to always make sure you can update everything before you even touch your own code. And project consistency. So what is a single page application? Code is retrieved with a single page load. The page doesn't reload at any point. Data and resources can be loaded and added to the page as necessary. So as you'll see, the first thing is we hit the polls app and it took us to the login screen, right? And so we just logged in. And so we can look at all these real quick. And if you notice, autocomplete, that's actually Postgres and Django. You don't need anything else to do like autocomplete. So then we can also open up the results. I wanted to play around with the charts React in case you ever want to do line charts or anything with financial data maybe. And then we can go and create a new poll. You can add choices. We're going to say what's the best Python web framework. And then you can keep adding choices. Blah blah blah. Django, Flask. We can submit it, and it'll take you right back. And so it's real smooth and quick. There's not any loading. We vote, and it takes you over there. Boom. All right. So to the stack, right? So the backend, Python 3, right? We don't deal with Python 2 anymore. Postgres, because who doesn't love Postgres? Django. Graphene is our Python GraphQL implementation. Django Graphene provides, it automatically makes your GraphQL schema based off your existing Django models. And they have a package for Flask as well if you just want to use Flask for your API endpoint. We also use a package called Webpack Loader. And what that does is it sort of takes our development assets when we're working in our development environment and loads them into the Django asset pipeline. And then we have Selenium browser testing, if any of you guys are familiar with that. That becomes real nice the more complex your web app gets. Once again, you already know about Django. Postgres has a bunch of cool stuff. Like I said, you can use trigram search to build autocomplete real easily. HStore field, you don't actually need NoSQL. You can put key values dynamically into an HStore field If you've never heard of that, array field for tagging. Like, this is just why I really like to use Postgres. You can also use Django if you're doing any sort of location-based services. Selenium is a software testing framework. It allows us to automate testing of our client. You can get it in basically Ruby, Node, or JavaScript, Python. Just about every language has it, or programming language yet. We can do cool things like take pictures of each stage of the test on different browsers and form factors. That becomes a real big issue when you're, especially with modern JavaScript applications, like you just never know how they're going to handle on all the different browsers, so you kind of want to do that test. Graphene, like I said, implements GraphQL, has support for building the schema of Django and Flask from existing models. So GraphQL is our query language. How many of you guys have heard of GraphQL or like used it? Yeah? So it replaces a REST API, right? You don't have different versions of your REST API. You're always making post requests. You can see here, we want the first question, and we just want the question text, and like it returns it, and it's like pretty nice. It's very simple. It avoids overfetching and underfetching, getting data you don't really need or want. Once again, implemented in multiple languages. Everything under the viewer node, we can authenticate. Like that's our first point. Like the viewer is the person looking at the app. And so, by the way, if you guys have any questions, please like just raise your hands too. But so that's how we do the authentication. Anything under the viewer app, we'll check for a JOT token, if you guys are familiar with that. Everybody is able to query the viewer node and get data off of it. And I'll show you guys later how that works exactly. Yeah, and so like under the viewer, we can put anything that should be public as well, right? We don't have to authenticate under the viewer, but we can. And if we do authenticate, then the user object will be the Django user. So what I mean by that is like, you know, if you have like, say you're like an e-commerce store, and you just want to like list a bunch of products, you know, that you don't need to authenticate for that, right? So that would just be like directly under the viewer. Have you guys ever, so who's worked with React too, by the way? Okay. We use a higher order component, which is just, it just wraps another React component and like it checks for JOT tokens. Like, so there'll be examples about all this later. So when we change stuff with a mutation, right, a GraphQL mutation is like how we're changing stuff on the server. We can use optimistic responses. Actually, this slide is a little dense. Let's just get to the good stuff. All right. Have any of you guys heard of Webpack, Babel, React, Relay, React? Have you guys used Webpack yet? How do you like it? Is it fun? Is it hard to set up at all? What? Yeah. We use Babel to get all the latest JavaScript features. I don't know if you guys ever used that. Yeah, like, so you'll see, if you've ever used vanilla.js, you might see like a lot of interesting like stateless components. We'll talk about that in a minute. Relay is a framework built on top of GraphQL. It provides things like pagination. So if you ever use Facebook's the big player here, like right backing React and GraphQL and Relay. And so when you think of pagination, here's the big gotcha with Relay, is the way that they do it is like you get the first 10 items, and then you say like after that, after like the last ID, like I want to fetch another 10 items. It's not like get this page. You see what I'm saying? And so all of the components are also styled with React MDC Web, which is it's actually using the official Google material library now. It's not like some people putting it together. It's like actually backed by official styles and everything. So Webpack is a bundler. We use it to bundle almost all of our client-side assets pretty much. That's not just JavaScript, it's CSS. It can be images or fonts. We can do cool stuff like hot reloading things in development. That makes things really quick. You don't have to refresh the page. Code splitting is really cool stuff. There's examples later. You can code split based on a route. You can code split based on a component. Like say you have a button that opens another thing. Like you don't even have to load that stuff until you hit the button. Or even the user could even just hover over something and it could cause like you to load whatever you need next. So that's cool. That keeps your initial load times really small, especially on mobile, which is like what we're focusing on nowadays. Because like really what happens is like React and Relay are kind of heavy. So like if you're on mobile, it's a lot of JavaScript for like maybe like a more anemic phone to try and render all that. So you kind of want to keep just as little data pulling as you need at a time. Service workers, Webpack does that as well. We talked about that a minute ago. So raise of hands, who's used React again? All right, so just React is a JavaScript library for building user interfaces. You can see like this is a class just exactly like in Python. It's got one method, and that's render right now, just to keep it really simple. And it's going to return a div with h1, and like in these curly brackets, we're just adding, 1, and that's just your super basic React intro. We'll have some more examples with like props and state and all that later. So what exactly is Relay? It's a framework for data-driven React applications. You get to declare your data exactly in the same component that you write it in. So it's not like some person is like doing the front end and some person's doing the back end. It's like you literally just say like this is the stuff I want from the back end and you're done with it. Like it also provides like Relay also is the client-side store for all the data. So that's where we can do like optimistic updates. Before the data even gets back from the server, we can say like, yeah, like you like voted, or like, yeah, you deleted that quote or that question. Am I going too fast, guys? Are you guys following? Is this good? Yeah? Cool. All right. Flow is a static type checker. I don't know if you guys have heard of like type checking. JavaScript is a dynamic language, so say like you have a function that doesn't get called until you're way out in production, you may not know about that error. It like literally could cause your whole application to just crash. And so what we do is we type check. We're just saying like we're going to get the viewer object like I was saying, right? From Relay, however we get it. And it's going to have one object. It's going to be a question. It's going to have question text, and it's going to be a string. And so what Flow will always be doing is like say if you have an array of things and you want to call like a function that's only on an array, like map, right? Or I'm trying to think of the Python equivalent, like append or any of that sort of stuff. It'll tell you if you're trying to call a function that you can't use that on, right? Like if it's a string and you try to say like, question text dot map, like something that should be on a list, it'll tell you right away. So you don't have to wait to see that. Obviously, you really don't want to go overboard with Flow. It's kind of like testing, though. You only want to use it once you start to really see like where you're sharing a lot of logic or like passing the same object around, and you just define a type. And once again, like Babel and Webpack, they sort of make all that stuff compiled down to like vanilla JavaScript. So yeah, PyCharm actually has really good Flow support. Babel is the one that'll take it and like strip it all out though towards the end. And you can run like Flow from the command line and it'll point out all the errors. I wish I had a video of it, but I didn't think you guys would be super interested in Flow just yet, because it's one of those things you'll dig into when you really need it, I feel like. And it's not. By the way, if you guys look at the Reango application, this is all there. Almost all the code that I'm showing you is like from the actual application. It might be a little cut down, so it's easier to read. Service worker, like I was saying, you can keep tracking actions while the user's offline. Honestly, though, I don't have service, but like, there's a lot of problems with service workers right now. Like, say have you guys ever deployed to Heroku? Yeah. So every time you deploy, your assets get like a different hash, just like a random string. But like if those assets aren't there, like every time you deploy, those old cached assets aren't there, like your service worker is going to try and pull those, and it's like going to crash. And so you like that's it. That's why I haven't added like complete service worker support yet. And even the Create React app, which is like sort of the official boilerplate starting point, had some issues when they like just enabled service worker, and a lot of people weren't even aware of it. So next, we're just going to go into the Reango workflow. This is going to have a lot of code examples. So yeah, like I told you we would talk about like state and props real quick. Like I showed you, this is a class for dialog. As you can see, we're passing a prop. We're just saying like, is this dialog open? Look at the state. And so we're never actually going to modify props. Props are passed down, and then like if we want to change something in this component, we're going to like define the state. And so we could pass like an open prop down into the dialog, and if there's not one, we're going to just say like true. Should actually be false. The dialog shouldn't be open by default, but you see what I'm saying. Client-side authentication. This is actually the root of our application. The first thing is the browser router. Then we have an app, which is just like a styled component. That's where your nav bar, your footer, and everything's going to be. And then the route with subroutes. This is like where you pass in a list of routes. We pass in the relay environment too. This is actually a function that's in the Reango app. Like I've tried to avoid using as many external libraries as possible. So like once you check out the Reango app, like you should be able to find like any of the like the authentication utils, like even the jot logic is in the app itself. And once again, this is we have a higher order component called isAuthenticated, right? And so it's going to check for a jot token. It's going to remove an old token if expired, and it returns a prop called the viewer is authenticated, and there's also a viewer is admin. And so right away, the first thing that happens, because like this is authenticated is actually going like around this whole function and checking. And so like we can put is authenticated anywhere. You'll see it later on at the routes. So GraphQL authentication happens, like say we want to get only the current user's polls and not everybody's polls. So here's the user. The user queries kind of get pulled in to the grand GraphQL schema that Django uses. And so like the viewer is kind of an artifact of the old relay. And it's just, once again, it's the idea that the person looking at the app is the viewer. And so what we're going to do is we're going to get the user model, and then we're going to, get the token user ID, and then we're going to get that user, and then we're just going to put that user object on the viewer. You see what I'm saying? And so the next thing is we write a user polls interface, and we stick that guy on the user node. And so now the user object will also have questions, which are the poll questions. And so every GraphQL query has a resolver. Django GraphQL actually does a lot of that for you, but you're pretty much going to have to write your own resolvers. And so what you usually just end up doing is like resolve questions. And since we put this on the user node, self is going to be user. And so it's pretty easy. We just get the question set all, and like boom. So the entry point of our like actual applications code, our custom, is the routes. And so what we have is we have a file. In the client directory, we have a folder called routes, and this is auth.js, and it's just the sign up and the login route. And once again, we have higher order components that say like, is this an authenticated route? False. So what that means is like, if you are logged in and you try to go to these routes, it's going to send you to the post login page. And so if you don't put false, then it is an authenticated route. And so if you try to go to that and you're not logged in, it's going to redirect you to the landing page. So what we do is we sort of like split, like just like the Django app is, just like Django splits its logic up into apps, we can split our logic up in the modules folder. By the way, modules and components are a folder in client, and we use Webpack to just let us type in modules instead of having to do like, you know, like double period to go back in directories. Like it's always just modules auth, and it's like makes it way easier. And so that route that we passed a few slides ago, that's what it is. Like, so the first object is just a landing page. The path, you know, is just like the root. And then what we do is we spread the auth routes. I don't know if have any of you guys ever seen like spreads in JavaScript? Yeah, it's good stuff. It just basically means like take all the objects here and spread them into this list. And so we can code split here or at the component level later. There's going to be an example in code splitting in the next slide. Like I said, higher order components, check for logged in users. Authenticating here also avoids us loading any data or even like hitting the endpoint. Like, so we don't, like, since we're code splitting after this, it's not even going to load any data if like you're not logged in. You see what I'm saying? So code splitting is pretty easy stuff. This is the bundle component is also just another component that's built in to the Reango application. And we actually have a chunk called auth. And so like what happens is this comment here, like, well, the function says like, once we load it, you know, import this module. And the idea of Webpack is that you can chunk stuff up. And so like I said, all the auth stuff is going to be in one chunk that the client loads when it's ready. So you won't get that immediately. And you see like we just registered at the bottom. React's also really cool because we can style stuff, right? And just like, this is like a blessing of Webpack, right? So we're writing JavaScript and we're importing like style components. And so you can see here, like, it's kind of nice to say like, all right, here's the root and here's the root. And so this makes it so you don't have to style your page every single time you want to use that. Anything where props children are like is anything in between the page component, you see? And so like that could just be the landing page, that could be the quotes page. Oh gosh. Yeah. So here's the thing about GraphQL. How did we get? Yeah. That slide's a little out of place. But we're about to get into like actually doing all the GraphQL stuff. And so I don't know if you guys have ever used like the choices on the Django field? And like, do you know how like you start in a, like, have you guys ever heard of this where you make a class of the choices and then like anywhere in the code, like since we put this class as like status, like anywhere we want, we can just say order status open. You see what I'm saying? Like then you just avoid having to like try and type this correctly everywhere. GraphQL will also complain if your nums aren't all caps. So this is your GraphQL node. This is like, oh man, coolio. So we just registered like the question model, and then this is the question node. You see like we register it like to the question, and then all of these are the poll queries, and so we can either just get like just one question, or we can get the filter. And so what that means is we can order it. You know, we can say get the first 10, like after the first 10. And then, so after we make that polls query, we just import it into the schema, and like there's your queries, here's your mutations, and your graphene schema. A relay fragment is how we reuse, like, a fragment is just saying we just want this data on this component. It's not actually going to fetch it. So you can see this is the question fragment wraps around the other thing and passes the data in. And so here's where here's like the actual thing that gets that data is with relay container. It uses this thing called a query render. And so anywhere you want to like fetch data, that's what you're going to use. You're going to use the query renderer. Like, so say maybe you have like a drop down and you had like maybe like the user addresses. Like, you don't really care about the user addresses any other time than when that drop down's open. So you can say like literally like only fetch that data like once this component is rendered. And so that makes it really nice. You can just dynamically load data without having to reload the page and all that jazz. Relay variables can come from URL params and query strings. Are you guys familiar with URL params at all? They're kind of ugly. They're really ugly. But the thing is like if you ever have a client that wants to be able to bookmark or share links, like that's how you're going to do it. You're going to put the variables, in here. And the query renderer will get that data from all over the place. I think I'm running out of time, guys. Does anybody have any questions though? Like, all right, we're going to write a simple mutation real quick. A simple mutation is really just, it's going to take the relay environment, and we're going to say we want to create a poll, and we're going to pass the input in. And what we want returned once the mutation succeeds is we just want the question text. And so, we make this mutation and we pass an environment, and then the mutation is this. And then we say, on complete, make a callback. And so that could be like redirecting you to another page. Variables are just the input. A more complex mutation might have on error, it might have an optimistic updater or regular updater. And so you might write the shared logic of the updating over here. Something like that might be where you open the vote dialog and you vote, and like you don't want to redirect to a new page and you just want to update that actual vote count. That's how you would do it. You would say like use the updater, get the root field vote on this store. Mutations are kind of confusing. So we use the Selenium browser tests. Like all of your components, if you just write like a class name, like we use BIM styles. You just say like, all right, there's a button component that's like submitting the sign up form. And so CSS selector, if you've never used Selenium, we have this concept of like an implicit wait, which just means like wait 10 seconds or whatever. And if that component doesn't show up, it's considered a failure. And so that's nice because we don't have to. The thing about React is like your components will take a second to render. So if you're not using that, you can say like explicitly wait or implicitly wait, but implicit waits are a lot faster. That might be a little confusing. Some just final notes. Reango also has some examples for factories. If you never use factories, it's a good idea because you want to always be able to bring on other devs or be in production or testing, and you want to be able to like have all of your data like there. There's nothing worse than like having to bring on a new dev on and like trying to like say like, oh, you got to talk to this API and this server and do all that. Allows us to reuse the same code while testing and staging data in the development environment. I also have like seeding, the concept of seeding and syncing, where like staging you might wipe out the database and restage completely, but seeding is like, get or find these things and maybe update them. So you should be able to run a sync command in prod. These are just some extra notes. Testing, you should design your tests to run in parallel. Test the GraphQL endpoints, then test Selenium browsers. GraphQL endpoints you can test way faster than the browser testing. You can tag tests, so we can actually test them as like GraphQL or browser, and we can just run the tests that we want. You should also tag remote API tests. They're like really brittle, known to fail. Like I was saying, BIM naming is just the idea that there's like, oh gosh, this is not BIM, but basically like you're putting a class name on the object and telling it like where Selenium can find it and click on it. Continuous deployment is nice. Once again, Reango actually has testing and continuous deployment like examples all in there. So code is automatically deployed to a staging environment. Staging environment automatically resets the database and then stages fresh data from the factories. Master branch pushes to prod, auto backs up the database, and migrates and syncs models. See, that's what I'm saying. This isn't just React and Relay. This is really like a full boilerplate. When is React and Relay a good choice? Complex data queries, when you don't want to load all data initially, pagination. But that's enough of the slide. Do you guys have any questions? Oh gosh. Redux. Relay is a replacement for Redux. And I'm a contributor on a couple other boilerplates that use Redux. I would say Meteor is a really good one. Well, I guess that's not going to happen. I guess this is why the mirror. So if you want a really good Redux example, I would use Meteor. It's also got a real time. But any other questions? Like Reango, Meteor is fun. I've actually used this for a lot of inspiration. This has real time if you want support. Once again, though, if you want to find Reango, it's like right here. Like I said, I committed 11 hours ago today. I work on it. I wouldn't mind having some contributors too if anybody like wants to just like learn how it works and everything. I know this talk was a little rushed, but anything else? Excuse me?
What are you planning for it? What's the next steps?
Oh, with this?
Yeah.
So I actually use this for a project that one of my startups that I've been working on for the last few years. And to be honest, that's literally what drives the requirements for Reango. Is it's like one of my personal business endeavors, and like this is just the minimal working example of it. If you guys want to see that, you know, I can show you it after this. But thanks so much, guys, for listening. What's up?
Components, basically you have to style your components.
Yeah, you can style your components individually.
Means there would be CSS in JS or any another approach you take.
Say that again?
You have opinions in Reango, or I can take any approach for styling my components?
Yeah, you can take any, I mean, I've tried to be as opinionated as possible because I liked that about Django, and that's sort of like why I named it after Reango. But yeah, you can actually just write like the components. Oh man, wait, we're looking.
Guys. T-shirt is being distributed at 222. Hey guys, इनको बता दो, their friends, tell them. Yeah.
Yeah. See, I'm trying to find a good example for you real quick. I can show you this after the talk.
Guys, just wait for a minute here. And any questions you can take offline here. So the t-shirts are being distributed at the room 222. So anybody who wants a t-shirt, they can go in. Don't try to make a chaos. Just go, in batches probably. The room number is 222 for the t-shirts. And the next talk that will be starting here is boost